My name is Lorian. It's been 3,142 days since my heart last beat, but I still feel the sun on my skin. I am a map, carved in flesh and rock, an eternal landmark on a patch of land that God forgot to finish. My last words were a warning, but they were also a measurement. They were the final coordinate in a survey of my own damnation. Listen to my story. Do not make the same calculations I did. Do not try to draw a line around the abyss. The job offer was a cartographer's dream, a siren song sung in numbers and dollar signs, a six-figure contract to perform the first-ever comprehensive topographical survey of the Blackwood Ranch in the most remote stretch of Montana. The territory was vast, a blank space on modern maps, its borders contested for over a century due to the lack of a definitive survey. For a man like me, who believes the world is a set of solvable geometric problems, it was the ultimate challenge. My job was to tame a wilderness with trigonometry, to pin it down with geodesic markers, and to give it a name and a shape that would hold up in a court of law. I saw it as bringing order to chaos. I was wrong. The chaos was the order. My arrival was a slow, deliberate shedding of the world. The paved highway gave way to a gravel road, which in turn dissolved into a dirt track that snaked through valleys of unnerving beauty. The scale of the place was humbling. The sky was a crushing, infinite blue, and the mountains on the horizon felt like the teeth of some great sleeping beast. I drove for 2 hours on that track, the signal on my phone vanishing bar by bar, until the only sound was the crunch of my truck's tires and the low moan of the wind. The ranch itself was a pocket of impossible vitality. While the surrounding land was rugged and wild, the Blackwood property was curated. The grasslands were a deep, uniform green, the cattle moved with a placid grace, and a single ancient-looking ranch house stood watch over it all, solid and silent. Ilara Blackwood met me on the porch. She was a woman in her 40s, with lines on her face that spoke more of weather than of age, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She held herself with a stillness that was either profound peace or profound terror. "Mr. Lorian," she said, her voice low and even. She didn't offer a hand. "You made it." "The drive was something else," I replied, trying for a bit of professional charm. "But this land, it's magnificent. A privilege to be the first to truly map it." Her expression didn't change. "Many have tried. This land doesn't like to be defined." I chuckled. "Well, that's what my theodolite and GNSS receivers are for. By the time I'm done, every hill and stream will be defined down to the millimeter." She just nodded slowly, her gaze drifting past me to the vast valley that formed the heart of her property. "There is one condition to our arrangement. A family tradition, you could call it. You can survey the entire perimeter, measure the outer hills, the borderlands, the riverbeds, draw your lines all around us, but on your final map, the heart of the valley, that central basin, it must remain blank." I blinked, confused. Blank? But that's the prime territory. To do a complete survey, I have to establish a central baseline, triangulate from the heart of the property. "You will have to find another way," she stated. It wasn't a suggestion. "Map the edges. The heart of this place is not for your maps." I thought it was bizarre, a landowner's eccentricity, a touch of rural folklore. Perhaps there was an old family burial ground there, or some secret she didn't want put on a public record. It was her money. If she wanted a hole in the middle of her map, I'd give her a hole. "As you wish, Miss Blackwood, I'll work around it." She finally looked at me, a flicker of something, pity maybe, in her eyes. "Good. Your cabin is down the path. You'll find it's well stocked. I will not disturb you." She turned and went back inside, the heavy wooden door closing with a sound of finality. The first few days were an exercise in frustration. I set up my primary station on a ridge overlooking the valley, a beautiful vantage point that should have been perfect. My equipment was state-of-the-art, the kind of gear that can measure the continental drift. I calibrated everything, linked to the satellite constellation, and began taking my initial readings, establishing my primary reference points. That's when the impossibilities began. I aimed my laser distance meter at a prominent rock formation on an opposing ridge. The reading came back, 5.734 kilometers. I logged it. An hour later, after mapping some closer points, I remeasured the same rock formation to double-check my calibration. The reading was 6.198 kilometers. It was impossible. I checked my station. It hadn't moved. The tripod was drilled into solid rock. I ran a full diagnostic on the laser. It was perfect. I checked the atmospheric data, clear as a bell. It had to be a glitch, a satellite timing error, a solar flare. There were 100 rational explanations, and I cycled through every one of them. The next day it got worse. I was mapping a small meandering creek. On my satellite imagery, it clearly flowed east to west. But through the lens of my surveying scope, my compass readings insisted it was flowing north. I walked down to the creek bed, the water cool against my hand, and watched a leaf float by. It floated north. I looked at my printed satellite map, then back at the creek. They were two different realities. My mind, a place of comforting logic and hard numbers, began to feel besieged. Every principle of my profession was being violated. Space, distance, direction. These were constants. They were the rules of the universe. Here they felt like suggestions. The feeling of being watched started on the third day. It wasn't the feeling of eyes on you. It was a pressure, a sense of spatial awareness that didn't belong to me. It felt like the horizon itself was a conscious observer. I would be hunched over my scope, and a sudden crushing sense of vertigo would hit me, the feeling that the mountain I was standing on was a kilometer to the left of where it should be. I'd shake my head and the feeling would pass. But it left a residue of deep primal fear. The land wasn't just inconsistent, it felt actively, malevolently deceptive. By the fifth day, I was convinced my multi-million-dollar suite of equipment was failing. The stress of the isolation, I thought, was making me paranoid. I decided to conduct the simplest, most fundamental test in surveying. I would measure a perfect closed square, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. A simple, undeniable proof. If I started at one corner and walked a perfect square using a compass and a calibrated pace count, I had to end up exactly where I started. If I didn't, then the laws of physics had ceased to apply. I intended to prove that my instruments were lying. I found a flat, open plain. I drove a heavy steel stake into the ground, a bright orange flag tied to its top. I attached a portable GPS beacon to it, marking it as Point A. My own receiver was synced to it. Then I began. I consulted my compass, pointed due north, and began to walk. 1,000 paces, each one measured, my boots crunching in the thick grass. I felt a sense of calm return. This was pure geometry, tangible, real. At 1,000 paces, I stopped. I drove a temporary wooden marker into the ground. I turned exactly 90 degrees to the west. Another 1,000 paces. Another marker, 90 degrees south. 1,000 paces. Marker, 90 degrees east. One final 1,000-pace leg. My boots came to a stop. I checked my handheld GPS. According to its readings, I was standing within a foot of Point A. My pace count was perfect. My angles were perfect. I had walked a perfect square. The relief that washed over me was immense. It had all been in my head, a series of bizarre glitches. Now, all I had to do was look up and see the orange flag of my steel stake, waiting for me. I looked up. There was nothing, just the flat, empty plain stretching out before me under the vast, silent sky. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had to be here. I checked the GPS again. The screen showed my position as a blue dot, sitting directly on top of the icon for Point A. But there was no stake. I spun in a slow circle, my breath catching in my throat. Had someone moved it? A prank? But who? Elara hadn't left the house. There was no one else for 100 miles. Maybe it had fallen over. I began to walk in a widening spiral from my position, scanning the deep grass. Nothing. 10 minutes turned into 30. The sun began to dip towards the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruises. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, began to seep into my bones. And then I saw it. It was a tiny speck of orange, far away to my left. It couldn't be. It was in the wrong place entirely. I pulled my binoculars from my pack, my hands trembling so badly I could barely focus them. I found the speck, twisted the dial. The image swam into clarity. It was my steel stake. My orange flag, fluttering mockingly in the wind. It was, I estimated with a sick, twisting certainty, at least 200 meters away from where I had left it. 200 meters away from the point my GPS insisted I was standing on. I stood there, frozen, as the last light of day died. I had walked in a perfect closed square, but the starting point hadn't stayed put. The land itself, the very fabric of the space I occupied, had stretched and warped around me as I walked. My scientific mind, my fortress of logic, crumbled into dust. This wasn't an equipment malfunction. This wasn't a magnetic anomaly. This was a violation. I had tried to impose my rules on this place, and it had responded by showing me that its rules were older, stranger, and utterly absolute. The heart of the valley was meant to be blank, because it wasn't a fixed place at all. It was alive. That stake wasn't just a piece of metal I'd lost. It was an anchor to the reality I knew, the world of predictable distances and solid ground, and it had been dragged into the abyss. I was no longer a cartographer mapping a piece of land. I was a man trapped inside a living, breathing labyrinth, and I had just gotten its full, undivided attention. If you want to know what happens when the map fights back, when the ground beneath your feet becomes the monster, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. You don't want to get lost out here alone. The long walk back to the cabin was a masterclass in psychological torment. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every gust of wind sounded like the world rearranging itself around me with a sigh. My faith in the bedrock principles of reality had been shattered, and in its place was a gaping void filled with a singular, terrifying question. If the ground itself is a lie, where do you run? I burst into my cabin, slamming the door and fumbling with the deadbolt. The metallic click was a hollow, pathetic sound against the immense living silence outside. I stood there, my back pressed against the wood, panting, my eyes darting around the small room. The cabin had been my refuge, my base of operations. Now it felt like a cage, a tiny, fragile box floating on an unpredictable ocean of hostile space. Sleep was out of the question. My mind was a frantic scramble of failed calculations and heretical observations. I spent the night with the lights on, pacing the floorboards, my surveyor's logbook open on the table. I tried to find a pattern, a mathematical constant to the distortion. Was it tidal? Magnetic? Was it expanding at a predictable rate? I was a man drowning, and instead of swimming, I was trying to diagram the wave that was killing me. It was all I knew how to do. By dawn, my fear had cooled into a hard, desperate resolve. I wasn't the first person to try and chart this land. Ilara had said as much, and my cabin, though clean, was old. The previous tenants must have left something behind, a clue, a warning, a shared scream across the years. My search began with a new frantic energy. I tore the room apart, pulling up floorboards, checking behind the rustic furniture, tapping the walls for hollow spaces. Nothing. It was as if the cabin had been professionally scrubbed of any prior identity. But there was one place I hadn't been given access to, a locked office in the main ranch house, which Ilara had politely told me was private family storage. I didn't care about her privacy anymore. This was about my sanity, possibly my survival. Under the cover of the morning mist, I crept up to the main house. Ilara's truck was gone, a rare opportunity. The office window was old, the lock a simple sash latch. A few minutes of careful work with my multi-tool, and I was inside. The room smelled of dry paper and decay. It was a cartographer's tomb. Rolled maps were stacked in dusty barrels. Flat charts were piled high on a massive oak table. It was a graveyard of failed attempts, a testament to a century of cartographic frustration. I pulled out the first roll. It was dated 1887, drawn in beautiful, precise ink on aging linen. The surveyor, a man named Alistair Finch, had meticulously detailed the outer perimeter of the ranch, but the center, the heart of the valley, was an angry smudge of spilled ink, with a single spidery note scrawled in the margin. The chains lie, the sextant spins. God has forsaken this geometry. I unrolled another, this one from 1952, a U.S. Geological Survey map. It was more modern, using aerial reconnaissance. Yet it suffered the same affliction. The edges were perfect, but the center was a void, marked only with the official sterile label, Unsurveyed territory. Taped to the back was a classified field report. The pilot's notes were chilling. He described how his flight path over the valley resulted in impossible instrument readings, how his compass spun uselessly, and how the photographs he took from 10,000 feet showed a landscape that didn't match what he saw with his own eyes. His final recommendation: declare the area a no-fly zone. Further attempts at aerial survey are inadvisable. Map after map told the same story. Different decades, different technologies, same result. The lines would approach the central basin and then dissolve into chaos. Notes in the margins became more unhinged over time. "The elevation is a paradox," read one. "The river appears on both sides of the hill simultaneously," declared another. One particularly disturbing map from the 1980s was covered in overlapping, contradictory contour lines, forming a nightmarish, impossible topology. In the center, the cartographer had simply drawn a panicked, screaming face. This place didn't just resist being mapped. It seemed to drive mad anyone who tried. I wasn't having an isolated experience. I was simply the next participant in a long, failed experiment. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Ilara knew. She knew exactly what this land was, what it did to people. Her warning wasn't folklore. It was a desperate attempt to keep me from falling into the same trap as all the others. My investigation had given me context for my fear, but it hadn't lessened it. If anything, it was worse. The phenomenon was historic, relentless. I left the office, carefully closing the window behind me, the ghosts of broken surveyors following me back to my cabin. The paranoia, now validated, began to evolve. It was no longer a vague sense of being watched by the landscape. It became personal. The territory, as I had started to call it, was no longer a passive puzzle. It was an active intelligence, and it was now focused on me. I decided to try and re-establish some control, to mark my own reality. I took a roll of brightly colored surveyor's tape and began marking a clear path from my cabin to the nearby stream I used for fresh water. It was a simple, straight line, maybe 200 paces. I tied ribbons around trees, creating an undeniable visual guide, a path that could not be moved or argued with. The next morning, I stepped out of my cabin to get water. The path was gone. Not just the ribbons. The trees I had tied them to were no longer in a straight line. The path now curved absurdly to the right, leading into a dense, unfamiliar thicket. It was a deliberate, architectural change. The land had rearranged itself to confuse me. A shiver of cold dread traced its way down my spine. This was a game. Refusing to be intimidated, I followed my compass, ignoring the rearranged forest, and found the stream. As I knelt to fill my canteen, I noticed one of my ribbons tied around a smooth river stone at the water's edge. I had tied it to a pine tree 50 yards away. I untied it. The knot was perfect, exactly as I had made it. But as I held the ribbon in my hand, I realized something was wrong. I had tied it in a simple loop. The ribbon I now held was tied into a Mobius strip, a single-sided surface, a topological impossibility to create without cutting and rejoining the material. I dropped the ribbon as if it were a venomous snake. It was a message. It was the territory showing me it didn't just control distance and direction. It controlled the very shape of things, the fundamental rules of physical space. Back in the cabin, I found the last traces of my immediate predecessor. The name on the contract had been Reese. I found his abandoned gear in a small shed. He wasn't a cartographer. His tools were different. Rock hammers, sample bags, a portable core drill. He was a geologist. Pushed into a corner of the shed was his footlocker. The lock was rusted shut. I broke it open with a crowbar. Inside was a collection of bizarre geological samples, a piece of granite with a perfect fossilized bird feather inside it, an impossible pairing of geologic timelines, a piece of sandstone that felt warm to the touch, pulsing with a faint, slow rhythm like a sleeping heart. And beneath it all, his field journal. His entries started out clinical, detached. He was here to study the strange magnetic readings and the unique mineral compositions of the valley. But his notes quickly descended into the same confusion and fear that had consumed me. He documented strata of rock that would reorder themselves overnight. He wrote of finding trilobite fossils, creatures from 500 million years ago, lying on top of freshly disturbed soil. Then his focus shifted. He stopped writing about the rocks and started writing about the space between the rocks. October 12th, he wrote, his handwriting becoming jagged, frantic. The anomalies are not in the geology, they are in the metrics. The distance between point A and point B is not constant. It is a variable. It changes. The space itself is plastic. It breathes. A week later, a new entry. Had a dream. I was standing in the cabin and the walls were moving, not shaking like an earthquake. They were flowing like thick liquid. The ceiling lowered itself. The floor rose up. The space was contracting around me. I woke up screaming, convinced I was about to be crushed into a single point of matter. His final entry was a single, terrifying sentence, scrawled so hard the pen had ripped through the paper. It's not the earth that's alive. It's the distance between things. And I know it's alive because it's shrinking around me. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A geologist, a man of solid earth, had come to the same conclusion as me, a man of abstract lines. We had followed different scientific paths to the same insane, impossible truth. That night I experienced Reese's nightmare. I was in my bunk, trapped in the heavy paralysis of sleep, when I became aware of a change in the room. A low groaning sound, like rocks grinding together deep within the earth, filled the air. My eyes shot open. The single window on the far wall, the one that looked out over the valley, was visibly smaller than it had been when I went to sleep. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. The groaning grew louder. I watched, helpless, as the wooden beams of the ceiling began to sag downwards, not breaking but stretching, elongating like taffy. The opposite wall was creeping inwards, the distance between my bunk and the fireplace shortening with an agonizing, inexorable slowness. Reese's words echoed in my mind. The space was contracting around me. Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke my paralysis. I threw myself from the bunk, landing hard on the floorboards, which seemed to bulge upwards to meet me. The room was now half its original size. The furniture was distorting, the table and chairs stretching and compressing to fit the new, impossible dimensions. It was a nightmare rendered in the language of physics. I scrambled for the door, my only escape. The doorknob, once at waist height, was now nearly at my shoulder. The door itself was tall and unnaturally thin, like an image squeezed in a vice. I clawed at the knob, my breath coming in ragged sobs. The groaning was deafening now, the sound of reality being crushed. With a final desperate heave, I wrenched the door open and fell outside, tumbling into the cold night air. I lay on the damp earth, gasping, staring back at the cabin. It was perfectly normal. The lights were on. The door was wide open, its dimensions perfectly ordinary. The window was its normal size. The groaning was gone, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets. Was it a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress and fear? I stumbled back inside, my body trembling uncontrollably. Everything was as it should be, except for one thing. My heavy oak surveying table, which had stood in the center of the room, was now wedged against the far wall, its legs scraped deep into the floorboards. And on its surface, where my logbook lay open, was a fresh layer of white dust. It was plaster, shaken loose from a ceiling that had, for a few terrifying moments, tried to crush me. It was real. Reese's warning, his final, terrifying discovery, was real. The distance between things was alive. And now, it knew my name. The line between a nightmare and a physical law had been erased. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in a corner of the cabin, my back against the wall that had tried to consume me, watching the inert, ordinary dimensions of the room with the unblinking vigilance of a man watching a caged predator. My instruments, my beautiful, precise tools of logic and reason, lay scattered on the floor, inert and useless. They were tools for measuring a world that followed rules. I was no longer in that world. By the time the sun's first weak rays illuminated the valley, a new kind of mind had taken root in the ruins of my old one. The surveyor was dead, replaced by the survivor. And the survivor knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ilara Blackwood was not just a client, she was a warden, and I was her newest prisoner. I gathered the evidence of my own dissolving sanity, Reese's journal, the impossible Mobius strip ribbon, and my own logbook, its pages filled with frantic, contradictory data that looked like the ravings of a lunatic. Fueled by a cocktail of sleepless rage and primal terror, I stormed out of the cabin and marched toward the main house. The very act of walking was a fresh torment. The distance to the house, a path I'd walked a dozen times, seemed to subtly resist me. The air grew thick, heavy, like I was wading through unseen currents. The perspective felt wrong. The house failed to grow larger in my vision at a natural rate, remaining a distant, mocking fixture for far too long before suddenly rushing into focus. The territory was awake, and it was aware of my intent. I didn't knock. I slammed the heavy front door open and found Ilara in the main room, calmly sipping tea and looking out a large window. She didn't flinch or show any surprise. She simply turned her head, her expression one of profound, ancient weariness. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Cut the act," I snarled, my voice hoarse. I threw Reese's journal onto the table in front of her. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this place? What did you do to him? What are you doing to me?" She looked down at the journal, her gaze lingering on the cover as if it were the tombstone of a relative. "We didn't do anything to him, Lorien. The land did. You're a man of measurements. You, of all people, should understand you cannot define something that refuses to be measured." "Define it?" I laughed, a sharp, unhinged sound. "The ground is warping under my feet. The walls of my cabin tried to crush me. This isn't a measurement error. This is a damn nightmare." "To you, yes," she said, finally meeting my eyes. Her own were filled not with malice, but with a deep, sorrowful resignation that was somehow more terrifying. "To this place, your measurements are the nightmare. My family has been on this land for generations. We are not its owners. We are its stewards. We have a pact, a covenant with it." "A pact with what?" I demanded, stepping closer. "With the territory," she whispered, giving it the name I had chosen in my own mind. "It's not an entity that lives on the land, Lorien. It is the land, a conscious, breathing, spatial dimension. It has only one need, one desire, to remain fluid, undefined, whole. It thrives in the abstract. Our pact is simple. We live here, we tend to the ranch, and in return for its strange vitality, we offer it privacy. We never ever try to map it." The pieces crashed together in my mind, forming a mosaic of absolute horror. My job, my entire purpose for being here wasn't just a task. It was an attack. "Every line you draw," she continued, her voice barely audible, "every coordinate you log, every angle you calculate, it's like a nail you are driving into its skin. It is an act of profound violence. You are trying to force an infinite fluid reality into a finite, rigid cage, and it is fighting back. So you just bring people here to die," I accused, my voice trembling with rage. "Another surveyor, another geologist. You just feed them to this thing." "No," she snapped, a flash of fire in her weary eyes. "We bring them here to work the ranch, peons, laborers, people who look at the hills and see only hills. But every decade or so, the outside world gets curious. Boundary disputes, resource surveys, they send someone like you, a cartographer, a definer. We warn you. We give you the rule. Leave the heart of the valley blank. It is not a request. It is the only advice we have for survival." Reese didn't listen, and you are more persistent than he was. A cold dread washed over me, extinguishing my anger. "What do you mean?" "You didn't just measure," she said, standing up and walking to the window. "You tried to solve it. The territory has felt your mind, Lorien. It has felt your logic, your relentless geometry. And it is learning. It doesn't just want to stop you anymore." She turned to face me, her expression grim. "It wants to understand you. It started to map you back." Her words hung in the air, more terrifying than any physical threat. So I stumbled back, away from her, away from this impossible truth. I had to get out. My logic, my science, it was not only useless here, it was the very weapon being used to unmake me. I ran. I didn't say another word. I fled the house, the screen door slamming shut behind me. My truck. I had to get to my truck and drive until the roads made sense again. I sprinted to where it was parked, the keys already in my hand. I ripped the door open, threw myself inside and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, comforting sound of mechanical order. I slammed the truck into gear and peeled out, spraying gravel, not even caring where the dirt track led as long as it was away. The ranch house disappeared in my rearview mirror. I was out. I was free. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the winding path ahead. Trees blurred past. The landscape undulated. After 20 minutes of frantic driving, I rounded a sharp bend, and my heart stopped. In front of me, nestled in the valley as if I'd never left, was the Blackwood ranch house. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. It was impossible. I had been driving in a straight line, away from it. I looked behind me. The track stretched out, empty. There were no forks, no turns I could have missed. The road itself, the very topology of the land, had looped back on itself, depositing me right back where I started. A wave of nausea and despair washed over me. I threw the truck in reverse, turned it around, and drove again, this time slower, more deliberately, watching every landmark. I passed a distinctive lightning-scarred oak tree. 10 minutes later, I passed the exact same tree again. The territory wasn't just a labyrinth. It was a closed loop, a prison whose walls were the curvature of space itself. Defeated, I abandoned the truck and decided to try on foot. I was a surveyor. I could navigate. I would ignore the deceptive paths and trust my instruments. I took out my professional-grade compass, a beautiful instrument of brass and precision. I held it level. The needle spun lazily for a moment, then settled. It was pointing directly at my own chest. I shook it, tapped the glass. It didn't waver. No matter which way I turned, the needle turned with me. Its magnetized tip aimed squarely at my heart. It was no longer reading the planet's magnetic north. It was reading me. I was its new pole. Fine. I tossed the compass aside. I had my GPS, a direct link to the heavens, to the immutable clockwork of the satellites. I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, acquiring a signal. A small, comforting map appeared, showing the surrounding topography. A blue dot showed my position. I started walking east, toward the theoretical edge of the property. I walked in a perfectly straight line, my eyes glued to the screen. The blue dot moved. It moved in a perfect, elegant circle, returning to its starting point every 500 paces. I was walking straight, but the space I was walking through was being coiled around me like a rope. My tools had betrayed me. My knowledge was a liability. Every attempt I made to impose order was being absorbed, learned, and twisted into a more perfect cage. I was well and truly lost. I wandered for hours, directionless, the sun an unreliable guide in the sky. The landscape seemed to shimmer at the edges of my vision, the trees subtly shifting their positions when I wasn't looking directly at them. The despair was so profound it was almost peaceful. I was a rat in a maze designed by a god. What was the point in running? As dusk began to settle, I stumbled into a clearing, and I froze. In the center of the clearing, bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun, was a porch. Not just any porch. It was an exact, perfect replica of the front porch of my childhood home in Ohio, 3,000 miles away. The peeling white paint on the railing. The third step that always creaked. The chipped ceramic pot where my mother used to plant geraniums. I could even smell them, a phantom scent of soil and summer blossoms on the Montana air. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't an illusion. I walked forward, my legs moving on their own, and touched one of the support columns. The wood was solid, real, the paint flaking away under my trembling fingers. I stepped onto the porch and looked back into the clearing. The surrounding trees were alien, the mountains were wrong, but this small island of impossible architecture was perfect. Ilara's words came back to me, a whisper in the ruins of my mind. It has felt your mind, Lorian. It has felt your logic. It started to map you back. This wasn't just a prison of warped space anymore. The territory had broken through the barrier of my skull. It was reaching into my memories, pulling out the blueprints of my past and building a new, more personal hell for me. It was no longer just trapping my body in its geography. It was beginning to survey my soul. Time, like distance, was becoming another casualty of the territory. I don't know how long I stood on that phantom porch, a ghost on the threshold of my own history. It could have been minutes or hours. The sun remained fixed at the horizon, a smear of gold and crimson that refused to set, holding the world in a state of perpetual twilight. The territory was not just bending space, it was pausing the clock, giving itself ample time to conduct its intimate survey. The scent of geraniums was overpowering, a sweet, cloying aroma that was both comforting and nauseating. My mind knew the scent belonged to a memory, to a home thousands of miles and 2 decades away, but my senses screamed that it was real, that the blossoms were right there. This schism, this violent disagreement between memory and reality, was the new frontier of my torment. The porch wasn't just a structure, it was an anchor, dragging my deepest self to the surface for inspection. I took a step back, off the porch, retreating onto the alien soil of Montana. As my foot touched the grass, the porch flickered. For a split second, the image wavered like a heat haze, and I saw the empty clearing through it. I recoiled, my heart seizing. It was a projection, a construct of terrifying fidelity, but a projection nonetheless. And I had a sickening realization. I was the projector. The territory wasn't just reading my memories. It was using my own consciousness as the lens to bring them into existence. This new understanding changed the nature of the game. If my thoughts could be given form, then my own mind was a minefield. What other memories, what other forgotten corners of my psyche could be weaponized against me? A new sound broke the unnatural stillness. It was the faint, tinny sound of a piano, playing a simple, stumbling melody. It was a tune I knew instantly, a melody that resonated in the deepest chambers of my being. It was the first song my grandfather, a passionate but clumsy amateur pianist, had taught me. He'd been dead for 15 years. The music was coming from the house, a house that should not have been there. Attached to the phantom porch was the phantom facade of my childhood home. The screen door, the bay window of the living room, it was all there. And through that window I could see a soft yellow light, the silhouette of a figure hunched over a piano. "No," I whispered, the word a dry rasp in my throat. This was a line I could not allow myself to cross. The porch was an architectural anomaly, but a person, a memory given flesh. That was a violation of a more sacred geometry. I turned my back on the house, on the ghost at the piano, and forced myself to walk away. I focused on the tangible, on the real, the feel of the rough bark of a pine tree, the sharp, clean scent of the mountain air, the cold weight of the geological hammer still hooked to my belt. I chanted the names of constellations, recited prime numbers, clung to any scrap of objective, impersonal logic I could summon. I was trying to starve the phenomenon, to give it nothing personal to feed on. The piano music faded behind me, replaced by a new sound, one that sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. It was the sound of a child crying. Not just any child, it was my own voice as a boy of 7, the day I fell from the oak tree in our backyard and broke my arm. It was a sound I hadn't heard in 30 years, a sound I shouldn't have been able to remember, yet it was rendered with perfect, horrifying clarity. The sobs were coming from a small grove of aspen trees to my left. "It's not real," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "It's a recording, an echo." But then the sobbing was punctuated by words, a child's desperate plea. "I can't get down, Daddy, help me, I'm stuck." My father. The memory wasn't just of the pain or the fear. It was of my father, his strong arms lifting me from the branch, his calm voice telling me everything would be all right. He had died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. The wound of his loss was still raw, a place of profound, unresolved grief, and the territory had found it. I stumbled toward the grove, drawn by an instinct more powerful than reason. The crying grew louder, more desperate. I pushed through the pale, trembling leaves of the aspens and into a small clearing. There was no boy. There was no tree. There was only a single ancient television set, the kind with a bulky cathode ray tube sitting on a mossy stump. Its screen was a blizzard of black and white static, and from its single tinny speaker, the sound of my childhood trauma was being broadcast into the empty woods. I stared, mesmerized and horrified. This was a new level of cruelty. It wasn't just recreating my memories, It was deconstructing them, reducing a moment of profound emotional significance to a distorted, mechanical playback. It was analyzing the data of my past. As I watched, the static on the screen began to resolve. A fuzzy image coalesced from the noise. It was a face. My face. But not as I was now. It was my face from my university ID card, 20 years old, full of an arrogant, unearned confidence I hadn't felt in years. The image stared out at me from the screen, silent, its eyes holding a kind of vacant pity. Then the image distorted, the static returning, and the crying abruptly stopped, replaced by a single, perfectly clear and resonant chime. It was the sound of my surveyor's laser distance meter when it successfully locks onto a target. It was sending me a message. I have a lock on you. I have your range. I have your measure. A new kind of terror began to dawn on me, one that was far more abstract and existential than a contracting room or a looping road. The territory wasn't trying to kill me. It wasn't trying to drive me insane in the conventional sense. It was performing an autopsy on my identity. It was dismantling my life piece by piece, memory by memory, reducing me to a collection of data points, a surveyor's logbook of a human soul. I stumbled away from the television, my mind reeling. I had to find Reese's final warning, the message he'd scratched into the quartz crystal. I'd read it, but I hadn't understood its true horrifying implication. I fumbled in my jacket, my fingers closing around the sharp, cold stone. I pulled it out, holding it up to the perpetual twilight. The words were crude, scratched with desperation. It doesn't want to be mapped. It wants you to be the map. I finally understood. The horror wasn't that the land was alive. The horror was that it was a vacuum, an emptiness that wanted to be filled. Reese wasn't killed. He was subsumed. His life, his knowledge, his essence, had been used as the raw material to create a new feature of the landscape. When you try to define the void defines itself with you. The world around me began to glitch, as if the territory's rendering of my reality was becoming unstable under the strain of its efforts. A tree at the edge of my vision would flicker, its textures momentarily replaced by a repeating digital pattern before snapping back into focus. A flock of birds flew overhead, but their wings didn't flap. They moved in a stuttering, looping animation of a single wing beat. The very air seemed to thin, and I could see the vague geometric underpinnings of the world like the wireframe of a simulation. My own body felt increasingly alien. I looked at my hands, and for a terrifying moment, I didn't recognize them. They seemed like objects, disconnected from my intent. I felt a strange detachment, as if my consciousness was a pilot in a failing machine. The sense of I, the core of my being, was becoming a vanishing point on a shifting horizon. I found myself back at my cabin, though I had no memory of walking there. The door was open. Inside, my surveying equipment was no longer scattered on the floor. It was arranged in the center of the room in a bizarre, ritualistic pattern. My tripod was set up, but instead of my theodolite, a bleached deer skull was mounted on top. My measuring chains were coiled around it like sleeping serpents. My logbook was open, and on a fresh page, written in my own handwriting, was a single complex equation. It was a formula for calculating geodesic curvature, but the variables were not distances or angles. They were concepts: grief, memory, regret. I hadn't written it. The territory was learning my language. It was moving beyond simple mimicry and into synthesis. It was creating its own dark cartography of the human soul, using my mind as its reference text. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to finish my work, an obsession. The need to complete the survey was no longer a contractual obligation. It was a biological imperative, as urgent as breathing. The hole in the center of the map was an unbearable vacuum, an equation left unsolved, and it screamed at me to be filled. I knew with a chilling certainty that this urge was not my own. It was the territory's desire, projected into my mind. It needed me to complete the final measurement, to willingly participate in the final act of my own unraveling, to stand at the center of the void and give it its final, definitive coordinate. My will was eroding. The distinction between my thoughts and the territory's intentions was blurring. I was losing the battle not for my life, but for my own authorship. My last words wouldn't be a warning screamed in terror. They would be a final, calm and perfectly calculated entry in a logbook, the last piece of data needed to complete a map of my own extinction. The compulsion to finish the map was a sickness in my bones. It was a cold, quiet hum beneath my own thoughts, a magnetic pull toward the valley's center. My professional pride, the very core of my identity as a man who brings order to the world, had been hijacked and turned into the instrument of my own dissolution. I stood in the cabin, surrounded by the ritualistic arrangement of my tools and the alien equations scribbled in my own hand, and felt the last vestiges of my own will beginning to fray. I had to fight. But how do you fight an enemy that wears your own mind as a disguise? How do you rebel against an urge that feels like your own? My only hope was Reese. He had walked this same path into oblivion. He had felt this same pull. But Reese was a scientist. He would have searched for a flaw in the system, a logical loophole, an escape clause in this metaphysical contract. His final project, whatever it was, had to hold the key. I had his journal, his rock samples, but Ilara had mentioned he'd been here for months. There had to be more. A new search began, this one not frantic but methodical, almost cold. I was emulating the man I believed could save me. I re-examined the shed where I'd found his footlocker. It was a simple structure of rough-hewn timber and corrugated iron. I searched it with a surveyor's eye, looking for inconsistencies in its construction. A loose floorboard, a wall cavity, a nail that was newer than the others. Beneath a stack of rotting burlap sacks in the far corner, I found it. A section of the dirt floor was slightly more compacted than the rest. I dug with my hands, then with the claw of my geological hammer. A foot down, my fingers struck something hard and flat. It was a heavy, lead-lined box, the kind used for transporting sensitive film or radioactive materials. It was sealed with a heavy-duty clasp. Inside, nestled in decaying foam padding, was Reese's final work. And it was not what I expected. There was no map of the ranch. There were no geological charts. There was only a single heavy plate of glass, a celestial map etched into its surface with painstaking precision. It was a star chart, but of a sky I didn't recognize. The constellations were twisted into unfamiliar shapes, the familiar anchor of Polaris absent. Reese hadn't been trying to map the ground. In his final days, he had been mapping the heavens. Tucked beneath the star chart was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with calculations and astronomical observations. His final entries were a revelation. He had come to the same conclusion I had. The territory was a localized, contained phenomenon. It could bend space, manipulate perception, and warp reality, but only within its own domain. It could move the hills, but it could not move the stars. The stars were his only fixed reference points, his only truth in a world of lies. His plan was brilliant in its desperate simplicity. He had been using the alien sky above the ranch to find a point outside the territory's influence, a place that was, for whatever reason, immune to the spatial distortion. A stable island in the churning sea of reality. He called it the null point. His final calculations, accompanied by a hand-drawn map, pointed to a single location, a prominent outcropping of black volcanic glass, obsidian, on the summit of the highest peak bordering the valley. His last written words in the notebook were not a warning, but a declaration of hope. The obsidian does not lie. It is ancient, non-crystalline, a product of pure, chaotic heat. It has no internal geometry for the territory to manipulate. It is a blind spot. It is the way out. A surge of adrenaline, of pure, unadulterated hope, flooded my system. It was a loophole, a back door. Reese had found it. He must have made it there. Maybe he even escaped. For the first time in days, the suffocating despair lifted, replaced by a clear, singular objective. I had to reach the obsidian peak. The compulsion to go to the valley's center was still there, a cold siren song in my mind, but now I had a counter-melody. I had a direction, a purpose that was my own. I gathered what I needed. Reese's celestial map, a compass I hoped would work once I was far enough away from the valley's core, a canteen of water, and my geological hammer. As I prepared to leave the cabin, my eyes fell on the deer skull mounted on my tripod. It was a mocking totem of my predicament. In a fit of defiance, I grabbed it, intending to smash it. But as my fingers closed around the bleached bone, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Scratched into the forehead of the skull, so faint it was almost invisible, was a set of coordinates, a latitude and longitude. My blood ran cold. It was my handwriting. I had no memory of writing them. I checked my GPS. The coordinates were for the exact center of the valley, the place Elara had forbidden me to go, the place the territory was pulling me toward. It wasn't just a compulsion anymore, it was an appointment, a destination I had apparently already logged for myself. There were two paths now. One, offered by Reese, led to a potential escape. The other, offered by the thing wearing my own mind, led to the heart of the abyss. The choice was obvious. I ignored the skull and burst out of the cabin, my eyes fixed on the distant, jagged peak of black obsidian. The journey was a battle against my own perception. The territory knew where I was going. It knew I was defying it, and it threw everything it had at me. The landscape became a surrealist nightmare. The ground would suddenly tilt to an impossible angle, forcing me to claw my way up a surface that should have been flat. Groves of trees would rearrange themselves before my eyes, forming impenetrable walls of timber that forced me into long, arduous detours. The soundscape was a symphony of my own failures. I heard the disapproving sigh of my deceased father, the mocking laughter of a former professor, the quiet weeping of a lover I had wronged years ago. Every step was a psychological ordeal, but I had Reese's map. The stars, even in the perpetual twilight, were visible as faint, cold pinpricks of light. I navigated by them, using the alien constellations as my guide. They were the only thing the territory couldn't touch. As I climbed higher, leaving the valley floor below, I felt the influence of the territory begin to weaken. The visual distortions grew less frequent. The hostile architecture of the forest gave way to a more natural, random wilderness. The pressure in my mind, the constant hum of the compulsion began to fade, replaced by the simple, clean burn of physical exertion in my lungs. I was winning. After hours of grueling climbing, I reached the summit. It was just as Reese had described. A windswept, barren peak, crowned with a massive, jagged formation of pure black obsidian. The rock drank the light, a patch of absolute darkness against the twilight sky. As I stepped onto the obsidian, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The background noise in my head went silent. The feeling of being watched vanished. The world, for the first time in weeks, felt stable, solid, and sane. Reese had been right. This was the null point, but my relief was short-lived. I had expected to find evidence of Reese's escape. A dropped tool, a discarded map, a sign of his passage. There was nothing. The peak was utterly barren, save for one object. In the center of the obsidian plateau, pointing toward the unrecognizable stars, was a single antique theodolite, its brass body green with age and verdigris. It was a surveyor's instrument, an old one, and it was anchored to the rock. A new, more terrible dread began to creep in, eclipsing my hope. Why was this here? I approached it cautiously. It was a beautiful, ancient piece of equipment, but it felt deeply wrong, an artifact out of time. I looked closer and saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Etched into the brass casing of the eyepiece, in elegant 19th century script, was a name. Alistair Finch, the name from the first map. The surveyor from 1887 who had written of forsaken geometry. This was his instrument. My mind raced. Was this a monument, a memorial left by Elara's family? I leaned down, my instincts screaming at me not to, and looked through the eyepiece. I expected to see the stars, magnified and clear. Instead, I saw only a perfect, suffocating, absolute darkness. A void. It was not the absence of light, it was an active, hungry blackness. And from that blackness, a single thought, a single realization bloomed in my mind, not in my own voice, but in a chorus of despairing voices, Alistair's, Reese's, and a dozen others I didn't know. This is not the way out. This is the observation deck. The truth crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Reese's brilliant plan, his logical escape, was the final, most elegant trap of them all. The territory didn't fight his logic with its own chaos. It allowed it. It guided it. It had led him and now me to the one place where its influence ended, the one place with a clear, stable view of its domain. It hadn't wanted to stop us from mapping it. It had just wanted us to do it from the correct position. As this horrific epiphany solidified, I looked at my own hands. The skin was becoming translucent. The lines on my palms were darkening, deepening, branching out like river deltas seen from orbit. My fingernails were taking on the glossy, dark sheen of obsidian. The process that had begun days ago was accelerating. I was no longer just being mapped, I was being terraformed. The compulsion to go to the center of the valley returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a pull, it was a purpose, my purpose. I understood now. The map needed a legend, the chart needed a key. The valley was an empty canvas, and I was the paint. The strange shifting rock formation Reese had written about in his journal. The geological anomaly he couldn't explain. It wasn't a feature he had discovered. It was a feature he had become. The horror was not that I was going to die. It was that I was going to be filed away. My consciousness, my memories, my entire existence were being condensed into a single final coordinate on a map that only the territory could read. I was the final piece of data. My escape attempt had been nothing more than the final, deliberate walk of a surveyor to his last station point, the place from which the most important measurement of all would be taken. I stood on the obsidian peak, a man on the verge of becoming a monument. The cold, sterile clarity of my fate was a weight far heavier than the terror it replaced. My hope had been the final, cruelest illusion. Reese hadn't found an escape. He had found the altar, and now the service was about to begin for me. The hollow wind that whipped across the summit seemed to whisper a single recurring question. What do you do when the only way forward is to complete the map of your own oblivion? Do you fight and shatter into a million meaningless pieces, or do you take the pen and in your final moment sign your own name onto the void? Tell me what you would do. Leave your answer in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel because you are about to witness a man take his final terrible measurement. You are about to watch a surveyor become a landmark. The descent from the null point was not a retreat, it was a pilgrimage. The hostile, shifting landscape that had tormented my ascent was now strangely placid, almost reverent. The trees seemed to part for me, creating a clear, direct path toward the valley's heart. The ground leveled itself, smoothing my way. The phantom sounds of my past fell silent. The territory was no longer fighting me, no longer testing me. I had accepted my role. I had agreed to its terms. The world was no longer a prison but a workshop, and I was being politely escorted to my final station. My own internal landscape had undergone a similar, terrifying transformation. The compulsion to reach the center was no longer an alien whisper. It was the quiet, resolute hum of my own heartbeat. My thoughts were lucid, clear, stripped of all emotion, save for a profound, crystalline sense of purpose. I was a cartographer, and I had a job to do. The fact that the map was my own soul, and the final coordinate was my own erasure, felt like a mere technical detail. My identity had been so thoroughly surveyed, so completely broken down into its component parts, that my own destruction now felt like the logical, elegant solution to a complex geometric problem. I walked for hours, moving with a dreamlike efficiency. The perpetual twilight held, the world suspended in a single golden moment of impending finality. Finally, I arrived. The heart of the valley. The blank space on every map. It was not a place of darkness or menace. It was a perfectly circular basin of the purest white sand, untouched by wind or animal. In the exact center of this circle stood a single, slender pillar of basalt, no taller than my waist, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. It was the source of the silence, the source of the stability. It was the origin point. The 000 coordinate from which all of this impossible reality was being generated. It was the tip of the pen God had used to draw this place before forgetting to lift it from the page. I knew, with an instinct that was no longer entirely my own, that this was where the final act had to take place. This was the point that had to be defined. I walked to the pillar, the white sand making no sound beneath my boots. As I approached, I saw that the top of the pillar was not flat but slightly concave, forming a shallow bowl. And within that bowl was a single drop of a substance that shimmered like mercury, yet was as black as the obsidian on the peak. It was a droplet of pure, unformed space, liquid reality. I looked at my hands. The transformation was nearly complete. My skin had taken on the texture of fine-grained igneous rock. I could feel the slow tectonic beat of my own heart, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the faint subsonic pulse of the land itself. I was no longer a man of flesh and blood. I was becoming a geological feature. This was the climax, the final fatal error that had been set up for me from the moment I took this job. I could have fought. I could have screamed at the silent sky. I could have taken my geological hammer and tried to shatter the basalt pillar, a final, futile act of rebellion. But the cartographer in me, the part of me that the territory had so carefully nurtured and corrupted, saw only the sublime, horrifying beauty of the task at hand. To leave this point undefined was an act of cosmic sloppiness. My entire life, my entire being, had been a prelude to this single perfect measurement. My fatal error was not an act of fear or desperation. It was an act of supreme, misplaced professional pride. I was the instrument. My consciousness was the unit of measurement. With a strange, calm deliberation, I reached out. I dipped my finger into the droplet of liquid space. It was neither hot nor cold. It felt of nothing and everything at once. I lifted my finger, now coated in the shimmering black substance. I knew what I had to do. The warning from Reese, "It wants you to be the map," was not a warning anymore. It was an instruction. I raised my finger to my own temple, and with a steady hand, I made a mark. The moment the liquid touched my skin, the universe broke. My first-person perspective, the I that was Lorien, shattered into an infinity of viewpoints. I was no longer a single point of consciousness. I was the entire valley. I felt the slow, patient grinding of the tectonic plates miles below my feet. I felt the roots of every tree, the thirst of every blade of grass. I could feel the weight of the deer skull in my cabin and the rust on the abandoned truck simultaneously. My thoughts were no longer a linear sequence of words, but a vast simultaneous network of geological time and spatial awareness. I felt Reese. He was not a statue. He was a low, resonant hum in the southern range, a pocket of geological density where the rocks remembered the shape of a man's despair. I felt Alistair Finch, a cold spot in the sky, his essence woven into the very fabric of the starlight he had tried to use for his escape. I felt them all, the dozens of other surveyors and scientists, each one a different note in the territory's silent, eternal symphony. They were not dead. They had been archived, and I finally, truly understood the rule. The heart of the valley must remain blank. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a prohibition. It was a plea for mercy. A blank space on a map represents potential. It is freedom. It is the unknown. By filling it in, by planting a flag of definition in its heart, I had not conquered it. I had perfected its prison. I had collapsed its infinite potential into a single, fixed, and eternal reality. A reality where I was now a permanent, load-bearing wall. My last human thought was a single, crystal-clear realization of the ultimate irony. I had spent my life creating maps to help people find their way, and my final act was to become a map that guaranteed no one could ever leave. Years later, two hikers, a young couple full of the easy confidence of those who have never strayed from a marked trail, find themselves hopelessly lost. Their GPS had died hours ago, their compass spinning uselessly. They stumble through the unnervingly silent woods, their calls for help swallowed by the trees. Finally, they break through into a clearing and stop, breathless. They have found what looks like an old, abandoned surveyor's camp. In the center of the clearing, they see a statue. It is a breathtakingly realistic sculpture of a man, carved from a strange, dark gray stone that seems to absorb the light. He is bent over a modern-looking theodolite, one hand resting on the eyepiece, the other on the tripod, as if he had been turned to stone in the middle of his work. The detail is impossible. The texture of his jacket, the strain in the muscles of his hand, the look of intense, focused concentration on his face. The woman reaches out a hesitant hand and touches the statue's arm. She gasps and pulls it back. "It's warm," she whispers, her eyes wide. The man kneels, examining the base of the statue, where it seems to grow organically from the earth. He sees faint, crude letters scratched into the stone, almost invisible. He traces them with his finger, brushing away the dust of years. "What is it?" the woman asks, her voice trembling. "What does it say?" The man squints, sounding out the words. "It says, 'Do not read me.'" He looks at his partner, a confused frown on his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Don't read you." It's a statue, but the woman isn't listening. She is staring at the statue's face, at the stone eyes that seem to hold an impossible depth. A strange, compelling thought enters her mind, a sudden obsession with the figure before her. Who was he? What was he measuring so intently? What secrets did his silent stone gaze hold? She feels an overwhelming urge, a sudden, desperate need to understand. And deep within the stone, a consciousness that was once a man named Lorien feels a faint, new tremor. A new mind has touched his map. A new survey, in the heart of a territory that is now perfect and complete, is about to begin.